I'm Vinod Mahi. Hi, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining. I'm Vinod Mahi, and I'm the Regional Solution Sales Manager for our Research Intelligence portfolio in Europe at Elsevier. Welcome to our third and final RDM webinar in this series. To recap, webinar 1 was about the submission, storage, and preservation of data sets and what institutions can do to support researchers. The second webinar looked at ways of keeping track of an institution's research data, the problem that Elsevier's Data Monitor solves. I'm really looking forward to today's webinar, themed RDM is a team sport, not a single player mission. I'm privileged today to be joined by two of our guest speakers. Max Petzold. Max will be sharing best practices in how a collaborative national infrastructure operates for research data. We will also be hearing from Gareth O'Neill on the future of fair and open data and the different initiatives and programs to facilitate the open science policy in Europe. There will be a discussion at the end, but please do submit any questions you have, and we'll look to answer these during the course of the webinar or at the end, time permitting. Before I hand over, I briefly want to recap on our learnings from talking and listening to many of you. Over the last 18 to 24 months, we have witnessed an acceleration towards the adoption of RDM policies and resources at institutional level. Many factors have contributed to this, but three key drivers include funder policies on data sharing, publisher mandates to link data with articles. The graph on the right shows a 5-fold increase over a 10-year period of the number of datasets attached to articles. And number 3, governments prioritizing open data and formalizing policy and frameworks to share research. We appreciate that institutions are at different stages of their RDM evolution and not one size fits all. Therefore, it is important to understand that there are resources available on a national and international level to support RDM, so institutions are not left alone behind and can also partner with others to achieve RDM objectives. With that thought, I'd like to hand the floor over to Max to talk through research data at SND.
So, thank you for this. So, good afternoon all, and I'm Max Petzold, the Director of the Swedish National Data Service. And just to give you a little bit of background, I'm professor in biostatistics, so I'm a big data consumer using data for analysis. And I'm also part-time head of the School of Public Health and Community Medicine here at the University of Gothenburg. So also a data producer. So I have like all 3 different roles, which is quite useful to understand the needs for the producers, but also the needs of the users, and trying to merge all this into one business. So I will tell you a little bit about the Swedish National Data Service, which is a national infrastructure then for research data. Our aim is to make research data accessible, and then of course both nationally as well as internationally, but we have a focus of taking care of Swedish data. But everyone working with data knows that there are no boundaries, and it's very hard to define. So of course we are international to some extent with a Nordic focus. What makes us not totally unique, but a little bit different from many other repositories is that we consist of a consortium of 9 universities, the 9 largest universities in Sweden, and having University of Gothenburg as a host university. And then together with this consortium, we built up a network of another 23, something is coming in my view here, a network of another 23 higher education institutions, and also nowadays other research active authorities, so not just universities. To give you more geographical view of what it looks like, you have the map of Sweden, and our owner universities are the ones that you can read. So University of Gothenburg, Chalmers University of Technology, and so on. Covering Sweden in a good way, and also representing a lot of international collaboration. So we are exposed to a lot of EU funding, a lot of Wellcome Trust funding, NIH funding, and other funders that come up with requirements, and then of course also publishers in different ways. The contribution from the 9 owner universities is that they contribute with expertise. So the office in Gothenburg, we are the one who run the show, but we are supported by active researchers at the different universities. So when we try to develop something within agricultural sciences, we ask the universities to provide us with expertise in that area. So the research data specialists in the office can ask active researchers within agriculture about what kind of metadata do they need, what kind of storage, what kind of data do they work with, and all that kind of questions you need to understand before developing new products. So that is a very, very important contribution from the universities. The other network members is more or less all the Swedish higher education institutions in the country. We are missing a couple of very, very small ones, mainly within art, and some other authorities, which is a very, very good mix. And we are now also discussing with some industry to develop joint activities in terms of training, so data steward training, but also working with their data in different ways. So it's like Volvo Cars, AstraZeneca, SCT, other big companies. So what we offer is support for open access to research data through training, assistance, and technical solutions. And I normally start with this point because normally when you talk about the repository, you think about the technical parts, storage, different technical solutions. But I would say that, of course, that's really an important part of our business. But what is becoming more and more asked for is support in different ways. So doing training, coming up with joint guidelines and that kind of things. And especially within talking about sensitive data and data with different limitations. So legal advice, that kind of questions that arise at all different universities, and very many have very little experience in. So we have built up a network of lawyers around in Sweden, which are helping the universities in different ways. Then we do have a comprehensive national system for making the research data fair. So we have some e-tools where you upload your data and you do the curation, you do the adding the metadata, and you can get support. So as a researcher, you're working with your data to try to make it fair. And the mainly librarians that are metadata experts are supporting from the university side, telling the researcher that, okay, you need to improve this part, or you need to think about this and that, and also advising on if data could be shared open or if it's sensitive personal information, that kind of issues. And when the data is created and we have good metadata, it will be published on our web-based research data catalog, which is then covering all these members, and we are also exporting the data, metadata, to a number of other repositories and their catalogs. Some of the data you could download direct, and some by request. So sometimes you need an ethical permission, or you need some other formal procedure to get the data. And this is something that I would like to point out that, I mean, there is a number of good repositories, but there are very few which have a good system to really ensure that data is shared in an appropriate way, so we don't start sharing sensitive data. So our development, we actually started off 1981, but then it's a very traditional repository within social sciences. So researchers were sending data to us and got help to create the data, got help to come up with the metadata, and then at the end published in the data catalog. But from 2016, we have developed into consortium. So from beginning, it was just University of Gothenburg, and now it's a really strong consortium with these 9 universities, where we build a knowledge base together and an infrastructure within the full network. So it's very much that the initiatives and the knowledge is actually from the other partners. It's not just from the office here in Gothenburg. And we are very happy about this. So sometimes when we run seminars, we ask one of the universities, could you please run this seminar? The knowledge is very quickly maturing now at the universities, and it's often based on the libraries. So we can connect very well to the research publications also. What we try to make the members to do is that they should keep the data, so the real data, not the metadata, the real research data, in their own repositories. So we built a system where we have a joint e-tool to do the data management, but the data preferably should stay with the owner. And when someone finds this data in the catalog, either you can download it directly from that university's storage, or that university get the signal that someone is asking for this sensitive data, and you need to follow the appropriate procedure to release the data. So our aim is that we will actually not continue running our own repository, the central repository here in Gothenburg, but all data should be kept with the owner. And this is to make the owners having control of the data and avoid different legal issues here. But we need to develop joint know-how and e-tools to make this up and running and develop in a good way. And just stress finally that thanks to this system, that the owner keep the data, and that we have a control system with experienced librarians and other data experts, we can handle also data with restrictions. So like I said, sensitive information, but also copyright, ownership, security issues, all that kind of sensitive information that the researchers are handling. We are not totally unique. I mean, there are a number of collaborations like this that have different components, but of course all are a little bit different, and we try to learn from each other and develop in a good way. There are some challenges, of course, working with a fairly large number of universities and owners, but in total, it makes the development in Sweden to speed up, and it's very much based on some kind of bottom-up approach, which strengthens the system in total. So, thank you for me, and we will have questions later on. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Max, for sharing the journey and accomplishments at SND, and how research data can be supported and operationalized on a national level. I think this shows clear evidence that RDM is indeed a team sport. Particularly impressed with the cataloging of data that you described in order to make it more discoverable and accessible. One of the many challenges that we hear from our customers. Thank you again. Gareth, I'd like to hand over to you now.
Thank you. I double check you can hear me okay?
We can do, yeah.
Perfect, thank you. So Gareth O'Neill, I am a principal consultant on open science at Technopolis Group. And I think for me, this RDM adventure started many years ago as a student in linguistics and working at Leiden University as a descriptive and theoretical linguist. And I remember over 10 years ago, working on a project for the Max Planck Institute for Psycholinguistics in Nijmegen. And I was asked to make my data set essentially fair. I had no clue what that meant. And all I knew was that I would be supported by 2 data stewards at the time from the MPI. And I must say, I wish I had known what fair data was before jumping into the project. It took a lot of work, a lot of expertise from the data stewards. But now looking back, I'm very happy we did it. The data set is now online, it's open, and it's fully FAIR compliant to be used and found and discovered. So I think for me, in any case, fair data is quite concrete, useful, but it does take a lot of effort to do. And I hope that comes back maybe in the discussion. So let's see if I can get my slides. Here we go. I'll leave that on the screen for a few seconds. If anybody wants to take a snapshot and use the QR code there or the bit.ly link, then you have direct access to the slides. There's not many, but there are links in there if you're curious about some of the topics I'm talking about. So I'll leave that up there for a moment. And what I will essentially talk about over the next 10 minutes is I will try to frame fair and open data. What is it? Why are we doing it? And then more specifically look towards the future on why are we doing it, not just for ourselves, but critically, what are we actually doing looking at research as a whole and looking at the developments that are coming, especially in terms of the European Open Science Cloud. Okay, so let's jump in. Now, this work that's happening across Europe and we see now taking place, especially in terms of data management, comes from a bigger policy push from the European Commission from around 2016, even earlier, on open science. And open science for them was not isolated. It linked up to 2 other major initiatives: open innovation, basically how to pull in more stakeholders in innovation, more companies especially, and linking them up to academia. Open science would be the way to help them do that, essentially by creating digital tools to share data, to share services, and to collaborate together online, digitally, collectively. And this linked to a bigger moral outlook on what they called open to the world. So how to create research and research outputs that benefit society, how to involve society in this, and how to not just work within Europe, but also, let's say, link up to other areas, regions on the global level outside of Europe. Now, open science is a big catch-all for many, many practices. I'm not going to describe what it is here. Many people will give a different answer. But in any case, some examples of the main practices here are many you'll know, such as open access to research publications, open data, or as you'll see a bit later, fair data, open source software, open peer review, open licensing, so how to license your outputs so people know what they can do with them, critical for FAIR, by the way, and for instance, citizen science or science communication. There's a lot of different aspects here. These are some of the main ones, and here today we're going to focus on data. Let me move to the next slide. So first to note is the distinction between fair and open data. These are often confused and they are critically very, very different. Fair data is essentially data that follows agreed standards on metadata. In this case, what are called the FAIR principles. This is a type of protocol with a list of principles that essentially makes a data set findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. Now, I note here, this is metadata we're actually talking about, but by creating this specific type of metadata, we can do something with the data set. A fair data set does not need to be opened. It can be open, but does not need to be, and thus fair data does not necessarily equal open data. We'll come back to that in a bit. The other side of the coin here is that open data does not necessarily need to be fair, and that is often a problem. Data is often opened, and it's completely useless because there's no metadata attached. A machine cannot find it, cannot be indexed, and thus either researcher can't find it, or it's in a format that's completely unbeneficial or unuseful to me. And thus, ideally, what we would want is that research data is fair by design. It's built into the project at the outset, built into the data management plan, and then potentially opened, depending on the type of data that it is. Some data should never be opened: biomedical data, sensitive data, military data, intelligence data, national security data, and other data potentially can be opened immediately or with an embargo if there are good reasons for commercialization. So not everything needs to be open, but critically, most data sets should be fair, at least for the research world. Now, I'm not going to go into the protocols. This is just to give you an idea of what the fair data standards look like. But essentially, these are the lists of agreements that are in place to make all of these different data sets be able to speak to each other. And what I really mean here is machines. We're not talking about humans. Humans will, of course, help to put in the metadata and describe the data sets. But critically, we're talking about making this machine actionable so that machines can communicate, that machines know exactly what's in a data set, and they can tell me, the researcher, what I can do with that data set, where I can find it, how, if I can access it, and what are any other restrictions that are in place there on that data set for me. So it can be findable. An example there is the metadata is assigned a globally unique and persistent identifier. You see it's quite specific here. It can be accessible, meaning metadata, for instance, is retrievable by this identifier using a standardized protocol. It's interoperable, so able to communicate across data sets and systems. For that, you need to use a format, accessible, shared, and broadly applicable language. And by following these protocols, ultimately, it will be reusable and useful. And in the case of reusability, we're talking about here in terms of licensing, and that it's richly described with adequate, correct metadata. Now, the discussion is always on how deep should you go in your metadata description. Critically, at a high level, looking across all data sets and disciplines, there should be a limited number of standards, protocols in place that everybody adheres to, such as, for instance, the name of the researcher, the project or grant that it was funded under. It should have a DOI to identify the data set, and it should have a limited description of what's in there and what you can do with it and licensing and so forth. Where it gets more complicated is when we go down into the disciplines, into the nitty-gritty, let's say, of the disciplines, and where they start adding much more refined or descriptive metadata so that this is fully, not just technically interoperable across different systems, but semantically interoperable across data sets, potentially even across different disciplines. And we'll come back to that. So the idea here in any case is that the FAIR principles are in essence a common language for machines to talk about data. And if the machines can talk about the data, then we can find it, we can access it, we can interoperate it, and we can reuse it. Let me skip ahead. So where do we stand in Europe at the moment on this? You can click the link there in the EOSC Observatory. There's a lot of other different graphs that you can play with there. But on the left here, in any case, what we see is that in many member states across Europe, that they have policies already in place that are addressing fair data. Now, they may differ in how concrete they are, but what you definitely see is that there are a lot of countries now starting to adopt fair. And the graph there not just shows you those that are actually including policies or practices on fair data at a national level, but also where there are actually good use cases and examples. I'll put a link in the chat maybe later so you can have a look at some of those use cases. On the right, we see those who are essentially providing policies for open access to data, so more towards open data, not fair. You can see here that there's a lot more countries supporting open data currently than fair data. And from my experience, that's correct. Fair data is quite complicated to implement at a national level, also at an institutional level. And I think it will take time for that to come. But what we definitely see from the member states is that there is interest and initiative to do this, and they are now starting to assign national budgets to pushing and driving the support of fair data. If I give a couple of examples, for instance, in France, we see that France at a national level is now providing training and support for fair data towards the institutions and researchers. Greece, for instance, has set up a data management expert guide to support researchers in the social sciences, so to help them do data management, which links to fair data. Poland is providing templates for data management plans across disciplines, specifically for researchers that are funded under their funding programs there, also linking to fair data. And Switzerland, through the Fairware project, is also actually developing digital tools to help researchers make their data fair. So for the researchers themselves, to actually make a data set fair and to check if the data set is following fair standards. So that's just to note that on a European level, we are definitely moving towards fair data. And as you'll see now in the coming slides, we're starting to move towards what's called the Web of Fair Data and Services, or the European Open Science Cloud. So for those of you who have not heard this, you can click the links. This is essentially a virtual space for researchers to share or find data, publications, software, basically digital objects, and for researchers to also collaborate both within their disciplines and across their disciplines. So this is a vital tool for supporting open science at a European level. And what it attempts to build is what they call the Web of Fair Data. Now, I say the Web of Fair Data because critically, all data sets ultimately in EOSC should be fair. They may not all be open. The idea is to start with open data, the low-hanging fruit, and then continue forward. And on top of that, then come the different services that are offered by public infrastructures and commercial service providers. So you have a data set, you can find it, but what do you do with it? Well, you can start linking up to the services that are on offer to actually visualize, process, or even exploit the data. Now, this EOSC is in development as we speak. It is out there. And what we're now seeing is many infrastructures, so public research infrastructures, are starting to link up to the EOSC. You need to think of the EOSC not as a box where we put everything, but rather as the connection between the different data repositories that are out there, between the different data sets, and between the different services that are also on offer. So EOSC, in a way, is a kind of a connection of the research data that's out there. And the connection is made through the common language of the FAIR principles. If you combine this or compare this to the internet is basically the Wild West of hyperlinked texts and applications, but critically in the center, there is an agreement in place for how they will communicate and transfer data. That's the Internet Protocol, or for instance, the Transfer Control Protocol. So you could imagine in a way that EOSC is an attempt to build a network or internet of data, and the language that they will use is the FAIR principles. Now, critically here, looking forward to the future, it's not just about getting access to an individual data set. Really, where we want to go when we look at the amount of data that we have, there's a complete explosion of data now where it's doubling almost on a yearly basis. Humans cannot deal with the amount of data that we're now producing, and not just within a discipline, but also across disciplines. So the idea here is to have a federated set of data, and I'm talking billions, if not in the future, trillions of data sets that are machine actionable by being described through the FAIR principles, and that this future federated data set ultimately will allow clever algorithms, machine learning, maybe in the future artificial intelligence, to look across the entire net and to basically start combining research data to a degree never seen before. We assume exponentially on the data, and that it can actually start to pull out correlations we never would have dreamed of, and ultimately provide us with a whole list of potential new avenues of research and future breakthrough discoveries. Humans are not irrelevant in this process, of course. The machines will basically just point us in certain directions. It will be for the humans to do the research, look through these avenues of research, and ultimately prove causation in the correlations. Otherwise, we're left with just random billion hits of correlations. Now, looking forward to the future, at least personally, I see two different ways. The first one, of course, is looking at future discoveries. So if you'll bear with me, I imagine in the future a simple search engine like this, where I type in malaria, and the machines go to work on the federated data set that is now there linked up through EOSC with billions of data sets. It will quickly pull out from the publications that malaria is associated with mosquitoes, probably around 95%. 5% may be complete random noise. We can ignore that statistically. The machine will then continue on and start identifying links to malaria, links to mosquitoes. For instance, looking on the left, it will look to see when there's been malaria outbreaks, where have they taken place, what time of the year, and start isolating exactly where it's happening and when it's happening. It will then go to the Copernicus satellite data and start mapping it on to future, well, let's not say future, to the past data sets from Copernicus, looking to see what was the temperature in those areas, what was the humidity, air pressure, water level, are there any other factors that we can pull in here to see that correlates with these malaria outbreaks or not. When did it not occur? Looking up on the top, it starts plugging through the, let's just say the commercial selling of particular medicines to see in this time, in this location, what medicines were on sale, what was selling, what was not selling, what seemed to be popular, what was not popular. And then it will start digging into the chemical databases of these medicines and chemicals, what seems to be active components, what seems to work, what does not work, and potentially start providing lists of future medicines, future vaccines, and so forth. It will have done all of this in matters of seconds, where a human or thousands of humans would have not been able to have done this in probably decades, when we really start talking about the amount of data sets here. So we're looking at the future of data here, not just in terms of me finding a data set to do my research, but critically a machine able to look across billions of data sets, start making correlations. Many of them will be completely useless, and then for humans to start looking down on the correlations. Now, to close, are there any potential issues with this? Maybe. I do see some, and I think we will have to try to think about how to deal with them. Although honestly, with the amount of data and the development of AI, it's possible that this goes way beyond our understanding and very quickly. We did not know, for instance, when Facebook was taking all of our data, that this would be able to be used very quickly to actually change human behavior and to influence politics and political procedures and votes. We didn't see that coming. Maybe we could have, but that's just a note that we need to think a little bit ahead when we open up such an enormous data set. A second idea of this would be looking at the data that's out there. Who can use this data that we put out there that is potentially open? Somebody can just hoover it up and then continue on separate from our data sets and do something with it. And it's where the do something with it comes into play. Now, in many cases, dual use technology data is not published publicly. It's kept behind closed doors or it's made confidential, but we don't know in the future if minor components of particular systems or developments could be potentially recombined or combined by a very clever AI system to partially or completely rebuild or recreate weapon systems or systems that could be used against us. We just simply don't know. And that we may need to set up factors in place to watch out for this and to control it. And the last point then on AI, I'm not too worried about AI. It's not intelligent at all at the moment, but it would be something to consider when you have such an enormous data set out there and you start running learning algorithms on it to develop AI, what it would potentially become in the future. How clever would it get? So definitely ways forward for data, major breakthroughs coming if we can achieve this. And I do think we need to keep in mind potential issues that may arise from opening up such enormous data sets and from potential new discoveries that we're not able to control or foresee. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Gareth, many thanks for your presentation and sharing these fascinating developments. As you've heard, there's a wealth of resources and programs available for institutions to learn from and take advantage of. And you've heard the examples in Greece, Poland, and France of national initiatives underway to upskill, train, and provide a little bit more guidance and confidence in the RDM space. This leads me to the panel discussion now, so please continue to submit your Q&A, but I'd like to open with the first question to you, Max, and please, Gareth, share your views too. So if an institution is considering investing in RDM today, given everything that we've heard and what's coming in the future, where do you suggest they start?
I would suggest that training is the most essential tool to train a group of research data specialists at the university. They should then continue with doing a training of like PhD students, running seminars and that kind of things. That's really the essential start, because it takes time until the researchers really start uploading data, making data fair and all this. So the technical solutions does not always need to be in place when you start off these activities. So I think training and outreach activities are most essential. Then you can add on technology during the process. That's our experience from the Swedish universities, at least.
Great, and yourself, Gareth. So considering everything that you've just presented and the different initiatives, what would be a good starting point for institutions today?
So I would agree with Max and say that training is essential. I would add to that support, and I'll be very specific. I would focus on support, first of all, through data management plans. So clear data management plans for the researchers so they know what to expect. This should be done already at the proposal stage, but if not, certainly at the project initiation stage, a data management plan should be mapped out and then adjusted over the project. Obviously with the relevant staff to support that and know what that means. But critically, I would push for the hiring of a data steward, especially if we're talking about fair data. It is quite complicated to make fair data. Now, there are tools that can simplify it for researchers, but critically, I think you need a professional who understands what data steward is, data stewardship is, and these people should be hired at the institutions or provided so that the researchers can continue on doing their main work, which is research. It should not be taking up a lot of their time doing mostly data management and assigning metadata. So just to note on this, the calculation is that for every 20 researchers, you need 1 data steward in full-time equivalents. So essentially, Europe is way behind in assigning these data stewards. There are ways to go around that. Many institutions say, well, we can't just hire these people and we need a budget for it and so forth. Delft University of Technology in the Netherlands took a very practical approach. What they said was every 21st PhD position, they will convert to a data steward. So rather than hire a PhD number 21, they just now hire a data steward. It falls within the budget. They reassign this position, and then they start again counting PhDs until they get to 21, and then they hire again a data steward. So they've taken a very practical approach there, and I would agree with that. Researchers need to be supported in fair data and in open data.
Fantastic. Thank you both. Max, I want to start with you again. How did you manage to build a collaborative culture at the consortia, with institutions working together, dealing with sensitive data, training, and the knowledge transfer that you currently see in place now? And following that, Gareth, what legal laws, policies, or restrictions should institutions be aware of, whether it's at a sector level, national, or international level? So Max, please.
Mm-hmm. It's a matter of time, I would say, that we have invested a lot of time traveling around to the universities, talking to the vice chancellors, talking to the head of the libraries, talking to the librarians, to the data specialists, the research data office, and all these people that are essential for us. And I'm just typing an answer in the question and answer section here, trying to emphasize that it's very much worthwhile investing this time to really talk to the universities, meet them, and engage them in different ways. Because now we are in like the harvest phase. We started off with having 30 specialists in the office, and now we have hundreds of specialists in the country, which is not, I mean, we would never be able to raise that amount of money to run some kind of central office, and we shouldn't go that way, I think. But now we have so strong engagement in the universities. We have like 200-300 people coming for our network meetings where we are discussing different issues and developing our procedures, whatever. And to some extent, there are more knowledge outside the central office in Gothenburg in the network. And it's exactly what we are aiming for, more or less, that the S&D should be of no use in some years. I mean, that's not really what will happen, but we shift our activities very much to follow the current needs, and the development is quick and the interest is great, I would say. So exactly how to do it, it's hard to tell, but you need to travel around and talk to people. I've spent many nights in different cities in Sweden during the years now. Thank you.
Yeah, presentations. Gareth?
Yeah, well, if this is about how organizations across countries or even member states, work together to work on data sharing and data visiting, then yes, it's a complicated procedure as has been put forward here. So when you're talking about data sharing, first of all, to note that means that organization A shares its data with organization B. What that typically means is that there's a transfer of data, and that transfer can be across national and thus legal boundaries. That could be from member state to member state, or it could be from European territory to non-European territory where, for instance, GDPR does not apply anymore. So you have to factor in legal, national, potentially regional restrictions or protocols that are in place, and take them into account when you're doing your data sharing. Why I say that, in 2000, and I think it was around 12 to 14, the Ebola outbreak happened in Sierra Leone. And to try to combat this outbreak, Sierra Leone opened up their data desperately. And when they opened up the data, the idea was to get immediate numbers of where the outbreak was happening and how to deploy the emergency services. A consequence of that data opening and data sharing was much of the data left the legal territory of Sierra Leone and was then further exploited by other organizations that did not need to comply anymore with their protocols because it was on their own territory. This, in the short term, of course, Sierra Leone was very happy to be able to deal with the outbreak and to set up these statistics dashboards that they used and to deploy the emergency services. But in the long run, they had given away data in essence, and themselves were not able to control the data and were not able to capitalize on the data. And this caused a lot of resentment and still has. As a consequence of this, we move now towards the term data visiting, where organization A does not share its data or transfer its data to organization B. Organization B technically, digitally comes to the data in organization A in their territory, meaning that they must follow the standard legal institutional laws, protocols that are in place, and that organization A can actually determine how much access they have, what they do with it, and what they can leave with. Typically, they don't leave with anything except an output. So this is something definitely to take in mind when you're talking about national or cross-national or regional sharing / visiting of data.
Thank you, Gareth. I'll stick with you, Gareth, on the next one. How can institutions influence or participate in the open science debate, roadmaps, and agenda, or the policies of national and international bodies? And again, Max, I'd like to hear from you, given the S&D consortia perspective too.
So there's many different contexts there, I think, right? So let me name one of them. So representatives of the member states, associated countries in Europe are collected together in what's called the EOSC steering board. So this is a group of the national representatives for EOSC and open science in each country, put together in a group in discussion with the Commission. And they help to develop the funding programs through Horizon Europe and Digital Europe. And they, in essence, collectively set the policies at the European and national levels. Now, these are the representatives of the ministries, but they are of course supported by experts in their countries. And these experts typically come from the universities, RTOs, and research institutes. So there is a kind of a bottom-up collection of expertise filtering into the member states. Now, separate to that, of course, you have many projects being funded on open science and EOSC. I'm working in one particular one. Here, for instance, it's called EOSC Future. And there you have a lot of European universities, funders, RTOs, companies working together in the projects to build the European Open Science Cloud, to build components of the cloud, and to set the governance and the policy making. So in that essence, they are contributing directly and getting funded for it. And maybe the third final one I'll mention is that in many countries now, there are podia for open science. The Netherlands, for instance, has what's called the National Plan Open Science. And there the research community is continually invited to engage in regular events and to basically provide input to the Dutch government, which then goes up to the European Commission. So there's multiple ways, I think, that the stakeholders, the researchers, the institutions can give input.
Thank you. Max?
Yeah, I can talk about the Swedish example, and what we created in Sweden, this network of more or less all higher education institutions, created an arena for having these discussions. So, I mean, this S&D network is where this discussion happens in the country. And then, of course, we connect to the higher levels, to the research council, to the ministries, but also that S&D via the University of Gothenburg is a member of the EOSC association. So we bring it out to the world. And currently, I'm just I just ran away from the Research Data Alliance plenary seminar here, or conference here in Gothenburg, where we have 500 people gathered talking about data. And I would say that at least 50 are from Sweden in this conference. And S&D is hosting this international event. And that's also a way to connect the university libraries with the global development in a good way.
I think, thank you. We've also got some questions now from the audience. So I think one for you, Gareth. Oh, I think you're typing an answer. This is with respect to, if an example of a data set is an Excel sheet, how can a machine determine the data set is interoperable? And going forward, will there be standards or fields for this?
Right. So let me answer Gordon vocally. So hi, Gordon. So first of all, to start at the end, yes, there will be a standard, and that standard is what I called the FAIR principles. That is the standard protocol at the high level across all disciplines. And again, what I said earlier was that the standards for fields will be determined by the fields themselves. They will need to decide what metadata they want to include in their specific domain or subdomain, and to what degree it should be described. So to what degree there should be a description. So at the high level, the FAIR principles work across domains, and like I said earlier, there should be a limited set there on what they should all deploy and select. But then within the fields, it'll be left to them to decide what further metadata they need to put in there and what descriptions there need to be in place. Now, this is both for technical interoperability and semantic interoperability. So when you look here, you say a data set is an Excel sheet. How can we make that interoperable? Well, first of all, the Excel sheet is a data file. It's a digital object. So if you want this to comply with FAIR standards, you need to fill in the specific protocols. Simple example, the Excel should have a DOI. It should have a descriptor. It should tell me what I can do with it. There should be a license on it so I know how it can be shared and so forth, following the minimum set of required FAIR principles. Where it gets more complicated is the usefulness of the data, the quality of the data, the format. Now, an Excel sheet has columns, has rows. If you don't tell me what the rows and the columns mean, it's a completely useless data set. It can be fully FAIR because it's described and tells you what's in there, but then the content itself, the semantic usefulness of the data set, and thus the ability for a machine to do something with it, is quite restricted. So there you need to follow standard protocols in your field and in data management so that there's a clear knowledge graph and a clear system in how you're actually using your Excel sheet. For instance, if you have quantitative figures in your Excel sheet, you should of course tell me what you are using as a measurement. What is the unit of measurement for that? If you don't do that, then I just have a bunch of numbers. So FAIR is not necessarily the same as the quality of the data or the semantic usefulness of the data. Obviously, the more you put into the file itself or the metadata, and the more the machine can understand, the more it can process the data set itself, and the more it can actually start combining data sets in and across fields. So if I have multiple Excel sheets, for the machine to really be able to combine them, first of all, it needs to know exactly what's in there. What are the fields? What are the data? What is the data telling me? What are the units of measurements? And then secondly, to really interoperate, you need to be able to combine, of course, the different types. And then we come back to the level of descriptiveness of the metadata, which is assigned to the fields. In the ideal world, each of the data sets is heavily described, and the machines can do something with it. A separate discussion from here, which I won't go into, is on, given that you have a data set, should you add peer-reviewed summaries of results of that data set so that a machine can even dig deeper into combining results? That's a question that's open at the moment. And the word for that we're using at the moment is nano publications, a specific assertion, scientific assertion, such as malaria is transmitted by mosquitoes. Could we add this to a data set, preempting, let's say, the results and peer reviewed? I don't know. That's a discussion for the future, I think.
Definitely. Thank you very much for that, Gareth. This brings us to the end of the webinar. So I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Max and Gareth again for their participation, and also to our previous guest speakers. Thank you all for joining today and for submitting your questions. We hope you've taken away some key learnings from the case studies that we've shared and listened to from industry experts and practitioners. Feel free to reach out to the speakers in case you have any further questions, or to me directly to learn more about how Elsevier is supporting and partnering with customers to support RDM initiatives. Before I close, I'd also like to say a special thank you to Alexandra and Yen for setting up these webinar series. And we hope to see you at our next event. I think that's on the slide now, so please reserve your spots. With that, I'll close the call now. Many thanks for your participation, and have a great afternoon, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Yeah.